So the question was asked, what are the origins, what is the genesis of Overlight? How did this thing get started?
Initially, I played a lot of fantasy role-playing games, and I never felt that divine I always thought that divine and arcane magic had it was sort of a weird division of philosophy, and so I wanted to come up with a game that really sort of put a lot of mysticism at the forefront in a way that I thought reflected like methods from anthropology and religious studies that I've engaged in.
So when did the distinct aesthetic come in? Because by the time you came to me with the idea, the aesthetic was already baked in as well.
I listened to a lot of prog rock and things like that, and I really liked sort of the kind of crazy imagery of certain bands in the late '60s and early '70s, and I thought that running around on those album covers and things like that would be fun.
Sure. So I guess by the time that George came to me with the idea, we were driving home from an Origins game fair back about 8 or 9 years ago at this point. And we'd actually just sat in on a world creation seminar given by another role-playing game designer, and sort of inspired by that, he floated this idea to me, and I immediately loved it and said, if you ever do anything with that idea, you've got to let me be a part of it. And I asked, like, what was, coming from the more mythic end of anthropology, I was really curious as to how the world became created. So it was in that car ride on the way home. Now, you had already had plenty of ideas for many of the shards and many of the races, and some of them have remained largely unchanged. But once we sort of created the space between the two of us, and we were like, well, what did the world like? How did the world get this way? And before we knew it, we were telling a story about, about spiritually minded sentient centipedes and, the destruction of the world.
Like you do.
Right, like you do. And it just went from there. And then we dabbled with it for a few years, back and forth, and somewhere along the way, all the 7 shards and their occupants got identified, and then we came up with Chromo as the name of the different colors, and that was the heart of it.
I told you I recently found the notes for the original concept, and they barely resemble the current incarnation.
But you can see the seeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was kind of seeing the single-cell organism that a big rainbow-colored Tyrannosaurus Rex grew from.
Right. What would be the best way to define the world?
I would probably call it maybe like high, weird, mythic, because it's we sort of rationalized the cosmology after we came up with the way we wanted it to look and feel, and the types of adventures we wanted it to facilitate.
Yeah, we knew that it was high concept enough that a short pitch was going to be necessary. So what ultimately became the catchphrase, the role-playing game of kaleidoscopic fantasy, was very much came out of the desire to be able to say quickly what the game was. And it was probably 3 or 4 years that we went back and forth trying to figure out how to break it down into a single phrase. And thankfully it was Larry, who you'll see in the game here, that came up with the word kaleidoscopic, which I think is perfect. So yeah, mythic fantasy, but without all of the expectations of fantasy, if that makes sense.